seated. Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Mr. Nurmi, you may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen, before we took our break, you and I were talking about the moments in time, matter of fact, for several minutes in time, when Mr. Alexander had his back to Miss Arias with his hands up, and sometimes with his face against the wall. Thank you. And those moments in time passed without Jodi implementing her plan. Doesn't make any sense. We get to this moment in time here. 5:29:20. He's seated. You can see that. We saw that earlier this morning. But this, according to the state, what we see in photograph number 160, this, according to the state, is the moment in time Miss Arias chooses to implement her plan. 5:30 and 30 seconds. The Mr. Alexander is nude, concede that. Vulnerable, so the state says. Although it seems highly less likely, because keep in mind, here he is right here. Seconds prior, he's looking at Miss Arias. Certainly would have seen it coming. His hands are up. But it is at this moment in time, the state says, that Miss Arias decides to put her plan into motion. She's stolen the gun. She's dyed her hair. She's rented the car. She's altered the license plate. She's got her gas cans. Everything is built up to this moment in time. That's what the state wants you to believe, right? And remember, before we talk about this, the testimony of Dr. Horn. Now, certainly it varied, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about lies and that spotlight of truth. But Dr. Horn says the wound to the vena cava came down to up. Down to up. So what we're to believe now then is that Jodi Arias, with all these chances in other moments in time, all these different chances when his back is turned and his defenses are down, that she somehow decides to get low to the ground and reach down and stab him. Stab him. Stab him. Doesn't that raise a question? Remember now, here's this big guy Strong guy, working out, getting ready for his trip to Cancun. Stab him. Jeez. You know, you wouldn't think you'd stab someone unless you didn't have a gun. Wait. With the state's theory, she did have a gun. She had a gun. Wait. So she chooses, and keep in mind now, and we'll talk about the change in story of the state's events, but keep in mind, the state went to great length throughout this trial to say, you betcha, no doubt about it, Jodi's a liar. She stabbed him first, and she stabbed him right there in the shower. Down to up. That's what happened. Apart from the logistics of that not making any sense, and you can judge for yourself how high off the ground Travis's chest is in that picture, why don't you shoot? Why don't you shoot? You've got a gun. This is what you've done. You've stolen this gun. You've gotten to this point in time. Why don't you shoot? Doesn't make any sense. Under this theory of premeditation, none of this makes any sense whatsoever. Now the theory goes on as it relates to premeditation to say, well, Jodi did this fantastic job of covering her tracks. She tried to clean up the scene. She threw a little bit of water around. She drove up to Utah. She hung out with Ryan Burns. And she made phone calls and she sent text messages to Travis to try to make it look like she wasn't there. And then they go on to say, and we'll talk about the stories in a minute, but this story of self-defense, that's a great big lie, right? That's what they say. But if it's a great big lie, you think that might be what you did. Or you might do something else way smarter than what Jodi did after this took place. She's planned this out, remember? A week or so in advance. She spent all this time on the road, all these hours, thinking about this moment in time. And you're saying this smart girl doesn't think of what she's going to do afterwards? Smarter things? Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. And why, if it's this pre-planned murder, again, do you stab, create this crime scene of chaos? We had a relationship of chaos and a crime scene of chaos. And there is a correlation there. And we'll talk about that later today. But let's think about that. It doesn't make any sense. None of it makes any sense as it relates to premeditation. Not a single thing. Well, now, what we just spoke about is self-defense. Jodi Arias told you another version of events. You have an instruction on self-defense. I'm not going to read that to you, but I want to emphasize a particular portion of that to you as we go back through the history. Because the history is such that what Jodi Arias told you on June 4th, 2008 is a product of a lot of things that happened beforehand. And when you assess the self-defense claim, you assess it, and looking at page 13 of your jury instructions, if at the very bottom, a couple things. Looking at this burden of proof, the state has the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant did not act with justification. If the state fails to carry their burden, then you must, it's not optional, must find the defendant not guilty of the charge. Now we begin at the last line of page 13. If there have been past acts of domestic violence against the defendant by the victim, the state of mind of a reasonable person shall be determined from the perspective of a reasonable person. This person right here, who has been who has been a victim of those past acts of domestic violence. So, what are those past acts and how do we define domestic violence? Because I think that kind of goes to the history of the relationship and the realities that were in Miss Arias's mind when she approached Mr. Alexander's home on June 4th. Domestic violence means any act that is an offense. Assault. We have an assault in this case. Was Jodi Arias the victim of an assault? Well, we heard several occasions where that took place, right? Well, we heard of at least 4 distinct occasions. We heard Miss Arias being thrown down and held down and not being allowed to leave a room. Actually, and that's unlawful imprisonment, aside from an assault. Double bonus for Mr. Alexander, assault and unlawful imprisonment. 2 acts of domestic violence. Did he endanger her with these acts? Sure. Slapping her, kicking her, aggravated assault, kicking her, breaking her finger. Now remember, there has been much made of this finger, right? When we talk about this aggravated assault, state says to you, my goodness, this didn't happen. This happened on June 4th. And we can tell it happened on June 4th because on May 15th, looking at Exhibit 452, that your, Miss Arias, your hand injury is invisible. So the state inquired. They said, see, you're a liar, Miss Arias. They even showed Exhibit 453, a hand hanging down. There's a close-up, say no visible signs of the injury. Again, the house of cards. Set it up, knock it down, call her a liar. It's what you got to do when you don't have evidence of premeditation. But keep in mind, you saw Jodi hold her finger up. You saw it broken. And you saw Miss Wilmot stand right next to Miss Arias. You saw that up close. And Miss Arias' hand draped over her. You saw that. You can assess for yourself the visibility and the apparentness of that injury. Assault. He kicked her. Held her down, wouldn't let her leave. Threatened and intimidated her. We saw that in all the text messages. Exposing her was going to be the worst thing that ever happened to her. He was going to expose her to everyone she knew, right? Public vilification. Sexual assault. What about that? We heard about that in what I would say is 2 different ways. Now, Miss Arias, and we heard a lot about her psychology at that period of time. And we saw tables, and we won't go through those again, where Miss Arias had real low self-esteem. Didn't think too much of herself. So it makes sense then, when Travis Alexander places his penis inside of her while she was asleep, and she kind of says no and pushes off and continues the act, doesn't want to break the vow of chastity. She doesn't consider that a sexual assault because they'd already done other sexual things before. She didn't say no at the time that he entered her. But the law tells you, and the definitions are there for you, that somebody cannot consent to sexual activity when they're asleep. That's just the bottom line. That is a sexual assault. And we have the instance on June 4th, don't we? Where Mr. Alexander, and you have your definition of sexual assault, grabbed Miss Arias, put her arm behind her back, bent her over the desk, and had rough vaginal sex with her. She says, it wasn't that big a deal because I didn't say no. But why didn't she say no? Because it was a better alternative to his anger, to his wrath, to his hits. It was a better alternative. She submitted out of fear. Fear of physical violence. That's the sexual assault. Now, you're also to consider in terms of the relationship, you have to consider things in the relationship as far as domestic violence. The type of relationship, the length of the relationship, the frequency of interaction, and if the relationship has terminated. Type of relationship, regardless of whether they call themselves boyfriend or girlfriend or not, whether they use that distinction. The relationship was a sexual one, romantic one. Whatever label you want to use, it was that type of relationship that we're talking about here. Romantic or sexual. The length of the relationship. Again, it began in the fall of 2006 and ended tragically on June 4th, 2008. The sexual portion of the relationship didn't begin right away because you recall Miss Arias had a boyfriend. She didn't want to be unfaithful to this boyfriend. She saw the relationship going nowhere. She broke up. But of course, in between there, keep in mind, Mr. Alexander was bringing Mormon missionaries over to the home to talk to Miss Arias and to try to bring her into his church. And another way to do that, of course, in terms when we talk more about domestic violence relationships with Alice and Violet, but that's a way of pulling Miss Arias out of the relationship she was in. She was in a sexual and romantic relationship with Darrell Brewer. But if you start to begin to follow the tenets of Mormonship, you have to metaphorically grab her and pull her away from that. And tell her she shouldn't be doing that before marriage. Of course, he redefines that later, but he pulls her away. And of course, as a Mormon girl, from what we know of Deanna Reed, you're not supposed to tell because that's a sin. He'd already done that once. He knows how to do it, and he knows that they'll keep the secret. The frequency of the interaction of this nearly 2-year relationship, pretty frequent. I mean, she was maybe his backup booty call. Maybe some days she was his first string booty call. Who knows? But there was this frequency of interaction, right? And if the relationship has terminated a length of time, unfortunately, as I said before, it terminated on June 4th. It never terminated before that. Not really. Because even when she moved back to Wairika, they still talked. They still had phone sex. They still chatted. They still did instant messages. They still did text messages. They did all sorts of things. So when Miss Arias goes to Travis's home on June 4th, 2008, she does so, going back to what I started out this morning, with an element of fear, with some lies being attacked, and we'll talk about those a little while longer because, again, that spotlight of truth. Keep in mind, this relationship, and sometimes lies bleed into dirty little secrets, don't they? Was a dirty little secret. She goes there with fear. She goes there with the lies, the dirty little secrets. She goes there with an element of love for this man. Because let's face facts. And certainly one of the things that we talk about when we talk about premeditation is that she always loved this guy. And there's no evidence to the contrary. But She goes there. Fear, love, sex. Well, there was sex that day, right? All those elements. All the elements of the relationship from Travis Alexander and Jodi Arias that began with sex. That began when he gave her the Book of Mormon and wanted oral sex. Began on other occasions as well. It went overwhelmingly interwoven from Ehrenberg to the home of Chris and Sky Hughes, to Travis's home, to her home in Palm Desert. It's all a woven tale for which geography is irrelevant, and love, fear, sex, lies, and dirty little secrets is pervasive regardless of where we're at. Regardless of where we're at. So, Miss Arias tells you that on June 4th, she arrives at the home. We talked a little earlier today about how he was watching YouTube videos, how he went to sleep, how they woke up, how they had this sex. And she told you how his bedroom we've seen so many pictures of, but how his bedroom, what is seen in Exhibit 249, and bathroom, how that became a crime scene. She talked to you about that, didn't she? Now, of course, the state says she's a liar. That nothing happened the way she said it happened. But ladies and gentlemen, there is some elements of objective evidence that show you exactly that what she is saying is true. Obviously, we have the computer evidence, right? She says what time you got there. We have the pictures. Now, another lie the state believes that there's another lie here, right? That before she arrives at this soon-to-be crime scene, she is lying about her abuse. That she was never a victim of physical abuse. Never. Why? Two reasons have been proffered by the state. One, because she never wrote it in her journals. She did not say, "Dear diary, Travis smacked the crap out of me today." She didn't say that. She didn't say, "Dear diary, Travis ejaculated on my face today." She didn't say that. She didn't say, "Dear diary, Travis choked me until the point I passed out." She didn't say that. She didn't say, "Oh, he slapped me upside the head in the car because I wanted to move back." She didn't say that. That shows that none of these things ever happened. And oh yeah, she didn't write, "Hey, dear diary, I saw Travis masturbating to an image of a child." And she didn't call the cops about any of those things. So therefore, she's lying. Again, it's another one of these house of cards because it seems to set up this premise as it relates to the journals anyway. That there's this requirement that a journal be complete. You know, he's asking Miss Violet, well, the journal's not complete unless it details everything. Well, I guess logically that's true. That's an unprovable premise. So she didn't write down every time she went to the bathroom on January 24th when she said nothing noteworthy to report. She didn't write all these other things down. And so therefore they didn't happen, right? I don't know what laws of journaling or what rules of journaling the state thinks apply here. But that's nonsensical. Because she's not required to do it. And guess what else? You know, the state had an expert up here. Well, one day she called herself an expert, one day she didn't. She might have been right the first day when she said she wasn't. But later she claimed to be a domestic violence expert, right? Janine DeMarte, 1 year of experience. Well, of course, she counted her time as a student. So if you count all those years, it was a lot more. But, you know, 1 year license, she's out there and she says, you know, she had this experience in domestic violence and actually administering questionnaires is what she did. But she said, what we all know, really common sense, is that battered women lie, right? They don't call the cops all the time. Alice Violette told us the same thing. They don't call the cops. They don't make a report. Like Alice told you, a vision out. Imagine, you know, someone's in a relationship for 10 years. They have 2 kids together. The guy has a good job. And he gets drunk and he hits the woman, right? According to the state's theory, and she doesn't report because she doesn't want him to lose his job. She doesn't want to get into trouble. She thinks it's a one-time thing. And she doesn't report. Now, under the state's theory, that woman was never hit because it wasn't in a police report. Well, let's shine the light of truth on that, shall we, ladies and gentlemen? How much sense does that make? That woman, she didn't report it. She wasn't hit. Come on. I mean, come on. That is repulsive. Now, the state said yesterday that Miss Arias was trying to, implying that Miss Arias is trying to victimize Travis Alexander all over again by coming up with this theory that he's a pedophile, right? And then she caught him looking at this image of a child. Well, let's go back to that same doctor who claims all this experience with her 1 year experience. She was asked a pretty basic question. I think even with 1 year experience, she could answer it. She was asked, what is the definition of a pedophile? And Dr. DeMarte said something to the effect of someone who has a sexual interest in prepubescent children. Okay. State says there's no evidence. No evidence to support that. That's not true. That's not true. On May 10th, 2008, you heard about 45 minutes of a phone conversation about Travis Alexander. And what was said during that phone conversation? Now keep in mind, obviously, the state's trying to write it off as a heat of the moment type of thing. But when Miss Arias has her orgasm, whether real or fake, according to the state, any woman who's faked her orgasm is a big liar, and nothing she ever said should be believed. She's a fraud. But putting that aside, there's this idea that after this orgasm is heard, after Miss Arias articulates this, Travis Alexander says, "That's so hot. Your orgasm is like a 12-year-old girl having her first orgasm." Who says that? You cannot write that off to the heat of the moment. That is sick, and that is wrong. You can't put any spin on that. You don't say that unless you have that interest. And keep in mind something else. He doesn't just say it once. Oops, you know, I screwed up. She says, "What'd you say?" Out of shock. "What'd you say?" And he doubles down. It's like a 12-year-old girl having her first orgasm. Let's hope, ladies and gentlemen, that he doesn't know what that sounds like. But he said it, and he said it twice. The fact that it doesn't say, "Dear diary, I saw Travis masturbating to an image of a child," doesn't matter. You have Travis Alexander's own voice saying this. And wait, one more thing, right? He doesn't just double down, he goes for the trifecta. He says, like corking the pot of a little girl. He said that, not Jodi Arias. Had Jodi Arias really been interested in this vicious attack of Travis Alexander, even though the state has contemplated to you that, oh, she was craving the media, and she did these interviews, and now, therefore, she's craving the media. She's throwing Travis Alexander under the bus. Gee, wouldn't it make sense? You've got the national spotlight upon you. You're hoping not to go to trial.
Objection, arguing facts not in
And
Sustained.
ask that it be stricken.
Stricken.
you have this camera in front of you. You have Inside Edition. You have news shows. You have all kinds of people that want to interview you. And you don't say it. She didn't want to tell Detective Flores that Travis Alexander had these interests.
Objection, arguing facts not in evidence.
She didn't want to tell anyone that he had these interests. If she had said, if this was a big plan, and if this was her plan to throw mud on him, she could have done so when she talked to Detective Flores, right? She didn't. She could have done so when she talked to Inside Edition. She didn't. She could have done so when she talked to 48 Hours. She didn't. It is a reality of this trial. It is a reality of the facts. And it is a reality of how this abuse came to be. The state says, well, he didn't abuse Deanna Reed. He didn't abuse, and I would suggest, even though they say that, I think that's probably not completely accurate. Because while they had some consensual sex, it was going against their religion, and I'm sure that was damaging to both of them. But he didn't abuse Lisa Anders, and he didn't abuse Mimi Hall. So therefore, he's not an abusive guy. But the relationship wasn't the same, right? She knew his secrets. She knew of his interests, hopefully an interest he never acted on. She knew his dirty little secret, and she was his dirty little secret, wasn't she? Because remember at this point in time on June 4th when she's pulling up to this home and this soon-to-be crime scene, Travis, his sexual, apart from what we just discussed and the comments about a 12-year-old girl, the state's right. There's nothing wrong with having sex as a young adult. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong or illegal about the intercourse that he had with Deanna Reed. Nothing. But and there's nothing wrong with the intercourse he had with Jodi Arias. At least the time she was consenting to it. But there was something wrong with it within the context of the church. And at this point in time, when they begin a sexual relationship in 2006 that goes all the way up to 2008, he was a one-time offender, right? He'd already violated the dictates of his church. One time. He needed to keep that dirty little secret that he was having sex with Jodi Arias. Because there could have been ramifications. He was a repeat offender. He would have been a repeat offender. There's no doubt about that. No doubt about that. So the relationship was different. The need to control her was different. For those reasons. What did we also hear on this tape that is demonstrative of this relationship? We heard Travis Alexander engage in what Alice LaViolette called character assassination, name calling. Whatever place you want to put it on the continuum. Remember at the beginning of the tape, before the sexual portions got played, you heard Mr. Alexander talking about Mr. Abe Abduhadi. And he talked about a confrontation he had with him. Well, not a confrontation per se, because if you recall, and if you choose to listen to this in your deliberations, Mr. Alexander says that he intimidated him in the bathroom. He was a jealous guy. Hey, I gave him the I'm going to whip your A vibe. Says something to that effect. I'm going to whip his ass because he kissed my girlfriend. Jodi says, he wasn't the girlfriend at the time. I don't care. I intimidated him in the bathroom. Jodi says, he said nothing but nice things about you. I don't care. I was going to whip his ass. He's a violent guy, right? He had a punching bag, and you saw the exhibits. He had a punching bag in the hallway outside his office. Maybe he needed that for when Jodi Arias wasn't around. I don't know. But he was also a big fan of the Fight Club, right? Cage fighting. Bleeding. Broken bones. Cage fighting. And we have him being violent in this phone call. And we have him assassinating the character of other individuals that were associated with Mr. Al-Duhadi. Remember this reference to Team Freedom. She talked about, oh, I may go to a Team Freedom event. Of course, Mr. Alexander probably knew that Mr. Al-Duhadi was a part of this and wanted to stop any perpetuation of any relationship. Maybe that was his motivation, I don't know. But he says those people are soulless. Those people are soulless. They're the worst. They don't care. They just want to drink and party, and they're terrible people. He's assassinated the character of other individuals, hasn't he? Those people on Team Freedom. It's all consistent. Character assassination. We saw it, right? We heard it. Whore, slut, three-hole wonder. The only thing you're good at is giving blowjobs. Things like that. Bitch. And you know, Dr. DeMarte, in an effort to try to, I don't know, save face with her, what appeared to be scripted testimony, says that's an inappropriate communication pattern. Something to that effect. That Mr. Alexander had an inappropriate communication pattern. Seriously? Inappropriate communication pattern? Who wants to be called a slut, whore, bitch, and three-hole wonder? That's beyond inappropriate. But all those things, the fear that she'd experienced in the violence before, the love she had for Mr. Alexander, the sex, the lies. Keep in mind now, the lies. Sure, Jodi lied. But Travis Alexander lied as well, too, didn't he? Not only we heard Deanna Reed talk about how he lied about having sex, he would lie by omission. The state made a big deal. If Jodi Arias didn't confess to everyone she talked to, she lied by omission that she killed Travis, right? Mr. Alexander, Miss Reed tells us, when people would ask him about his virginity, he just kind of shrug it off and laugh, make it look like he was still a virgin when he knew he wasn't. He lied. He lied when he told that Jodi Arias was a stalker. We're going to get into that a little more later, this idea that she's a stalker. She wasn't a stalker. Look, if she was a stalker, right? Why do you take a picture of your stalker naked on your bed? So fearful of Jodi, his stalker was Mr. Alexander, that in Exhibit 393, on 11 of 2006, he sends a picture of his penis. How fearful of his stalker is he if they're using Exhibit 434? If he attends prepaid legal functions with her? How fearful is he of this stalker if, as they do in Exhibit 432, they go to the Sacred Groves, a sacred historical site in New York, a sacred historical site to the Mormon Church? How scared of his stalker is he if they go to the balloon festival, as we see in Exhibit 431? How scared is he? How scared is he in Exhibit 435? When while still in New York, they travel to Niagara Falls together. How scared is he? You see, ladies and gentlemen, part of the reality of the situation with this whole idea is that Miss Arias was a stalker is that it was a facade created by Mr. Alexander in case she ever got caught sneaking in or sneaking out. She's crazy. She won't leave me alone, you know, that sort of thing. That's why she's over here at 2 in the morning. That's why she's over here at different hours of the night. Ladies and gentlemen, we know there was a continued sexual relationship, and it was an out. It was an out for him. Maybe Travis Alexander had fear that this would be exposed, not only affecting his status of the church, but maybe, and probably wrongfully so, maybe he feared that his friends would lose respect for him if they knew that he was engaging in this behavior. He had to come up with some sort of ruse in order for this behavior to continue. And we know it was a ruse because we know he took pictures and had Jodi Arias over, and this idea that, oh, we don't know if she was welcome over there in the house on June 4th. He was taking pictures of her naked on the bed. You don't do that with your stalker. So this sex, the love, the fear, the lies, and the dirty little secrets all culminate on June 4th. Unfortunately, what happened is that Mr. Alexander's bedroom became a crime scene. Now, Jodi Arias told you that she was taking photographs. And we don't need to go over through all the photographs again. We saw the photograph we were talking about, a couple of photographs, Exhibits 159 and 160, if I remember correctly, about Mr. Alexander sitting in the shower. One we see his face, one we see his body. The argument you heard yesterday was the photograph of the body sitting in the shower was not accidental because it was in focus. Doesn't seem like a photograph anyone would particularly take, but it makes sense. Jodi Arias said she was holding the camera, she was looking at some of the photographs, deleting some, deleting others. It makes sense that she could have been holding the camera steady and accidentally took that picture. Okay. So we're at this moment in time, and this is when things differ, right? Up to this point in time, we've talked about facts that are entirely consistent, for which there's no real dispute, at least in terms of what happened. What to make of it, there could be dispute. But this moment in time, right, about 5:30, this is the pinnacle, right? Where the state says Miss Arias, who already has a gun, reaches down and stabs in an upward motion. And that after this happens, sometime after this happens, we have Exhibit 161. One of the photographs that was recovered, right? Jodi Arias says, and it's certainly coming in a little clearer today over there, 5:31 and 14 seconds, and you'll have a chance to have this back with you. But Jodi Arias says she drops the camera. This photograph is entirely consistent with that, isn't it? It's a photograph up towards the ceiling. Jodi Arias says Travis Alexander yelled at her for dropping the camera. He called her stupid. He says even a 5-year-old could hold a camera. Now remember, this is a budding professional photographer who loves photography and who takes great pride in it. He's attacking her at her core, insulting her, and Miss LaViolette talked about those kind of insults, right? The, I guess they'll hire anybody type of insults. Attack her right at the core. Even a 5-year-old could hold the camera. You're stupid. And then he jumps out. And then he attacks. And then he holds her down. And she remembers that on a previous occasion when he held her down, he had choked her to the point where she lost consciousness. Now, granted, yeah, right, there's no diary entry. But you still have the right to believe or disbelieve what she says. But she remembered that time. And she thought it might go further this time because the instances of violence were becoming more frequent and more severe. She feared that it might go farther. This time was different. He was angry. He was angry in a different way. She talked about getting out from under there. And you or your fellow jurors who aren't here anymore, ask her some questions about this area here. The bathroom. Where everything was. Where everything happened. Where was the camera? Where were other things? And Miss Arias walked you through various places where the camera was, where she remembered it to be. And she told you about the fear she felt. And again, I'm not going to read your self-defense instructions, but the fear she felt at that time and the reasonableness of the action she took are to be assessed from her as a prior victim of domestic violence. Sexual assault, take your pick. She tells you that after she gets out from underneath him, she runs through the closet. She tells you that while in the closet, she remembers from her experience as a maid to Mr. Alexander, not wearing the French maid outfit, but cleaning for him, that he had owned a gun. She tells you, showing Exhibit 69, let's start with Exhibit 69. She says, I grabbed the gun off the top shelf. And we learned from Detective Flores' measurements that if we believe the shelf to be the same as it was 5 years ago, that it's about 7 feet tall. And that's where she says she got the gun. Maybe it shows up a little better in Exhibit 70. She grabs the gun. She runs through the closet and grabs the gun. Now, you recall it wasn't that many days ago Detective Flores was on the stand saying that he didn't measure the height to any of these other shelves when he went back in there. Remember, he said that he put them in the identical position that they were on June 4th. And he measures them, and he measures the top, and he measures the ceiling, but he doesn't measure any of these shelves. Now, ladies and gentlemen, one of the things that the state is postulating to you is the idea that Miss Arias is lying because a closet right there that day, at that point in time on June 10th, 11th, 13th, when Mesa Police Department was processing the scene, that nothing's disturbed. Therefore, there's no way it could have happened the way she says it did. Of course, ladies and gentlemen, there's no real evidence to show that. We don't know if she could have stepped on the shelf, to the side, to one of the railings. We don't know. She testified as best she could remember, but we don't really know. But one thing we do know when we look at this closet is even though we don't know the height of all the shelves, one of the things we know, we see a lot of shirts there, right? And they're lower. And for Detective Flores, Miss Arias is about 5'5". You've seen her stand up. It's probably about accurate. And this smart woman, if she was lying and making this up, boy, it would seem a lot smarter to just say, oh, the gun was at hand level. It was under one of those shirts. It was behind one of those pairs of shoes. It was somewhere where I grabbed it easily. But she didn't say that. Not only that, but we've seen evidence that this crime scene is cleaned up. Could she have put a shelf that was dislodged back into place? Yeah, she could have done that too. It would just be super simple if Jodi Arias was lying about this to say the gun was somewhere else. There's bags there. There's all kinds of areas where she could say I grabbed the gun from. And as a matter of fact, if you look at Exhibit 69 and 70, she pretty much picked the most inconvenient location she could have, right? If this is a lie, she picked the most inconvenient location she could have, the very top in the corner. Okay. Now, Jodi Arias told you about how once she grabbed this gun, she ran out towards the bathroom. Drawing your attention back to Exhibit 249, we see how she was able to run through and run back out the other way. Two openings to this closet. She grabs the gun. She backs out, right? Per her story, she has the gun in her hand and she's running away. Travis Alexander is still charging. Now, there was some discrepancy. She told Miss LaViolette she shot him in the closet. Well, certainly there's no evidence of that, and there's no evidence that Jodi Arias even said that. Alice LaViolette said, oh, that was my mistake. Because I'm not as concerned about things that happened on June 4th. I'm there to... Okay. So Miss LaViolette tells you, well, I might have been mistaken, my notes were wrong, that sort of thing, right? There's no evidence that Jodi Arias says I shot him in the closet. But to say it again, build the house of cards, call it a lie, and knock it back down. Okay. So Miss Arias backs out of the closet, points the gun at Mr. Alexander, and shoots him as he's leaping towards her. Now recall the entrance and exit of the bullet wound, right? Dr. Horn, yesterday, or actually 2 days ago now, we had the long day. He was saying, oh, the bullet never penetrated the brain. And then he says, oh, I made a mistake on my report. That was a typographical error. Or that it really did. But we see the trajectory, this right from the left cheek to the right nostril, right? As he's diving. He says it couldn't have been the first wound because it would have immediately incapacitated him. But now here we go. The light of truth, right? Right here. Let's shine it right here. Because you heard during this trial, Detective Flores testified. Detective Flores testified at a hearing in this case in 2009. Said the gunshot was first. I talked to Dr. Horn after the autopsy, which happened in July, and he told me the gunshot was first. That's what he told me. Gave me his opinion, his opinion, his opinion. Then he sat up there and told you, well, I wasn't given my opinion. Keep in mind, this other proceeding was sworn testimony. And we went back and forth about the importance of being accurate. I wasn't inaccurate. It was a misunderstanding. And Dr. Horn said, I didn't talk to him the next day. We know Detective Flores had testified that he did. Right? That he wrote that in his report. So somebody's not telling the truth. Now, it perhaps is not fair to shine the spotlight completely on the detective when Dr. Horn should be sitting next to him so the spotlight can get them both. But somebody's not telling the truth there, right? And when the detective went through and relayed all these things about, the shot first and what happened next, again, shot first, And then Dr. Horn comes forward and says, oh, no, the shot was last. He was already dead. It was never my opinion that it was shot first. I never would have said that. So again, somebody's not telling the truth here. But when you assess that, let's think about that from the standpoint of what happened. The chain of events. Because at a certain point in time, and you heard the doctors talk about that point in time, after 2009, there's at various points in 2010, Miss Arias tells what happened. She tells this story, and then lo and behold, all of a sudden what the detective testified to about Mr. Alexander being shot first, all of a sudden that's wrong. And there's no way that I said that. There's no way that this happened. Shine the spotlight, ladies and gentlemen. Lies. Somebody's lying here. And in this case, it isn't Jodi Arias. Okay. So she tells you he dives like a linebacker and takes her down. The gun goes off. He falls on top of her. And he's on top of her. And he's been shot. And he says, fucking kill you, bitch. There's a threat there. Obviously, there was a threat there before because he's chasing her. She was in reasonable fear that he was going to end her life. It's part of the reality, ladies and gentlemen, of this day is that out of this scene, out of this picture, behind which many dirty little secrets were held, somebody was not going to make it out alive. It was either going to be Jodi or it was going to be Travis. Now, what Jodi told you after that is that after she remembers fucking kill you, bitch, is not very much, right? She tells you that she has lost her memory. She didn't have it, perhaps, but she doesn't remember. And Dr. Samuels talked to you about flight, and how the hippocampus doesn't necessarily process those memories. She may never had them in the first place. And we talked a lot about PTSD, and we don't have to go over that again. We know all the tests. We know the tests were consistent. And we know that trauma is trauma, whether it was a bear, lion, tiger, or this mysterious gopher that was introduced a couple days ago. Right? We know that. We know trauma is trauma. And we know that she was attacked by two intruders or by Mr. Alexander. There was trauma there. And let's face it, going back to lies and things of that nature while I'm thinking about it, Jodi Arias been wanting to get Mr. Alexander, like I said before. She would have just said, oh, he attacked me, he's a pedophile, he's terrible. But she came up with this silly lie about two intruders to try to avoid the reality, to try to avoid the airing in front of these cameras of everything that was at one time a dirty little secret. See, one thing this trial did is it ripped the lid off all these secrets. And if Jodi Arias, I would submit to you, wanted to rip that lid off, she could have done it when she sat down with Detective Flores on July 15th or July 16th. One of the things, though, about this memory loss, you had some questions about it. It was referred to as the fog, right? And that she didn't have memories of what happened next. She told you about a couple things, though, related to her memory. She said she had, and I think it was in response to one of your questions, she had some vague memories of being on her knees and dropping the knife and screaming. And that she had some memories of the knife going in the dishwasher, but she's not sure, did that happen on a previous occasion or did that happen on June 4th? She wasn't sure. And you know, probably the argument you're going to hear or that you have heard is that this is just made up. That she remembers exactly what she did and she's lying. She's feigning this memory loss. This memory loss was real. We went through the testimony. Dr. DeMarte tried to say lie every other word if she could about Jodi Arias. said, oh, if she would have remembered, she knew what she was doing, that's why there was, she knew there was blood on her hands and killed him, that sort of thing, right? She knew, it's feigned, it's fake. She's lying about it. Well, the problem is, if she were lying, again, if she were lying about this stage of events, this smart woman, if she's lying about this stage of events, we saw the closet, we talked about that, wouldn't she actually make up a lie where she remembered? Where she said, he chased me down the hallway and he kept screaming, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill you, you're going to die. Say anything like that? No. Could she have made up a story where Travis Alexander grabbed the knife and said, I'm going to kill you? And then dropped it, or she knocked it out of his hand? She could have done that, right, if she was lying? She didn't. She didn't. And the proposition put forward that, oh, she had years to think about this, and this is what she came up with. And this fog is part of this, right? This fog is not made up because ultimately it is instead an inconvenient truth. It would be much more convenient for Miss Arias to tell you the sort of things that we just talked about. To paint this horrific scene, right? Of what he did. She didn't do that because she couldn't. She couldn't. Now, whether the memories were there and never moved into the portion of the brain that stores them, or whether trauma prevented them from being processed, we don't know for sure, obviously. But we know that this is indeed an inconvenient truth. And keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, they say, oh, this woman's smart, she's planned her lies, and she's planned this crime for weeks, and now by the time she's with Detective Flores, it's been months. And she comes up with, on the second day, she comes up with this lie about the intruders, that if you look at the evidence, it can't be proven, but it also can't be disproven. That'd be a pretty good lie, right, for one night. If you were lying and you had 2 years to think about it, like I said, I think you'd think of something better, right? You'd think of something better. And here's the reality of the situation, ladies and gentlemen. The one thing that is clear. This scenario of Jodi Arias being forced into doing something, forced into defending her life, between what we see in Exhibit 159 and what we see in Exhibit 162, is a much more plausible scenario than premeditation. Because, ladies and gentlemen, this happened, and this shows, we talked about how premeditation doesn't make any sense. The pictures of him with his hands against the wall and his eyes turned away from this area. We talked about how premeditation doesn't make any sense. This, ladies and gentlemen, the theory of self-defense is one that is so much more plausible because it happened like that. Something happened. We have to face the reality, as much as the state doesn't want you to believe it, that something happened in this moment in time. These few minutes between 5:29:20 and 5:32:16. Something happened at that moment in time.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will take the noon recess. I would like to take 1 hour today rather than an hour and a half. Does anyone need more than an hour for lunch? If so, please raise your hand. 1 hour, we'll see you back at 1 o'clock. Please remember the admonition.
Please stand for the jury.
We are in recess.